The air hums with voices, doesn't it? 1,000 melodies wrap around us every moment, each one singing its song, competing for attention, demanding, pleading, shouting. In this clamor, there's a voice soft as silk, tender as dawn's first light, yet deep as the ocean's floor. It calls, not with urgency, but with certainty. You might not hear it immediately. Oh no, it's patient, it waits. But the question lingers, what happens when we ignore it too long? What truths pass us by unnoticed in the rush of the world? Let me tell you a story, or maybe a few. Let me draw you into a reflection so rich and haunting you'll feel compelled to hear what comes next. The voice I speak of, it doesn't shout, it doesn't push, it doesn't clamor for the front row. No, it knows its power, its place. This voice, subtle as a whisper carried on the evening breeze, finds its way to us not through force, but through stillness. Have you felt that nudge, that undeniable pull in your chest when the world seems to pause just for a moment? That's the voice I'm talking about. The voice that's always speaking, even when the world grows louder and louder. You see, people spend their lives searching for direction. They look to maps, to stars, to books filled with advice and answers. They consult gurus, friends, strangers on the internet. They search for signs in the cracks of sidewalks, in the laughter of children, in the randomness of life itself. But there's something simpler, something deeper, something more constant. A voice that doesn't waver with the winds of the world. It's in those quiet moments, isn't it? When the noise finally dies down, when the demands of life fade into the background and you're left with only yourself and the hum of existence. Maybe it comes in the early morning before the sun has stretched its golden arms across the horizon. Maybe it comes in the still of night when even the stars seem to rest. That's when it speaks, clear and soft, as though it's been waiting for you all along. But let's be real, listening isn't easy. Oh no, listening takes courage, it takes intention, it takes silence, a silence that most people fear, because in that silence they might confront themselves. And in the hustle and bustle of this wild, relentless world, who wants to sit with themselves long enough to hear what's underneath? But that's the beauty of it, isn't it? The voice doesn't care about your fear. It doesn't flinch at your doubts. It speaks anyway, always calling, always waiting. There was a woman I once knew, a vibrant soul with eyes like uncharted galaxies. She spent her life chasing something, happiness, purpose, belonging. She thought she'd find it in success, in applause, in the fleeting moments when the world told her she was enough. But there was always a void, an ache she couldn't name. One day, in the middle of her frenzy, she stopped, just stopped. And in that moment of stillness, she heard it. Not a command, not a demand, but a knowing. It was as if the truth she'd been running from had been there all along, waiting for her to be still enough to notice. I'll tell you another. A man, grizzled and weary, hardened by life's storms, believed he'd seen it all, felt it all, endured it all. He thought he had nothing left to learn. But one day, as he sat alone under the shade of an ancient tree, the world hushed. He heard something, a quiet urging, a gentle reminder. It wasn't dramatic. There were no flashing lights or booming voices. It was simple, almost imperceptible. 3 strikes, 3 times he heard the knife. It was off in the distance, above him, in the trees and the valley. And there was his revenge. He felt a vibration flash over his own body, but in that whisper was a truth so profound. It softened the edges of his heart and led him to a peace he'd long forgotten. You see the thread here? The voice doesn't come to the loud, the boastful, the ones too busy to pause. It doesn't shout over the noise, it waits. And when it's finally heard, it speaks not in riddles, but in clarity. Not in anger, but in love. It knows the language of your soul, the truths you've buried, the dreams you've let slip through your fingers. It knows you. So why is it so hard for us to listen? Maybe it's because the world has taught us that value comes from volume. The louder we are, the more we're heard. The busier we are, the more important we must be. But that's a lie, isn't it? Because the most profound truths, the most transformative moments, they're not loud. They don't shout. They unfold in the stillness, in the quiet. They emerge when we dare to tune out the world and tune into something deeper. There's a story, perhaps you've heard it, of a young child who asked an elder how to hear the voice of wisdom. The elder didn't answer right away. Instead, they took the child to a stream where the water sang softly over smooth stones. "Listen," the elder said. The child listened, but heard nothing beyond the rushing water. "Be still," the elder whispered. And as the child stilled their body and quieted their mind, they began to hear it, a melody beneath the current, a rhythm to the flow. "That," said the elder, "is how wisdom speaks." It's there, friends, in the stream of your life. It's there in the moments you overlook, in the spaces you rush past, in the pauses you're too afraid to take. It's not waiting for you to earn it. It's not holding its breath for you to deserve it. It simply is, steady, unwavering. But you have to listen. You have to want to hear it. You have to push past the noise, past the chaos, past the distractions that keep you from yourself. Because that voice, oh, that voice, it carries what you need, not what you want, but what you truly need. It carries the answers you've been searching for, the healing you didn't know you could find, the direction you didn't know you'd lost. But here's the truth few dare to admit. Most people are afraid to listen. They fear the stillness, not because it's empty, but because it's full of revelations, full of truths they've buried under years of busy schedules, endless pursuits, and hollow distractions. They fear what the voice might reveal about who they are, what they've done, and what they've ignored. It's easier, isn't it, to drown in the noise than to stand still in the quiet and hear what's really there. I once met a man who lived his whole life running from that voice. He filled his days with tasks, his nights with noise, his mind with anything that would keep him from pausing long enough to hear it. He feared the weight of what it might say, the truths it might bring to light. But life has a way of quieting us when we refuse to do it ourselves. When illness came to him, when the world grew still and the tasks no longer mattered, there was nothing left but the voice. And in its presence he found not the condemnation he'd feared, but a grace so profound it brought him to tears. That voice didn't scold, it healed. It didn't judge, it guided. And in his final days, he found a peace he'd been chasing all his life in all the wrong places. So I ask you, what are you afraid to hear? What truths are you running from? Because the voice isn't here to break you, it's here to build you. It's here to call you back to yourself, to remind you of the path you've always known deep down, but perhaps forgotten. It's a strange thing, isn't it, how we resist the very thing that would free us, how we cling to the noise as though it were our lifeline, when all the while it's the stillness that holds the answers. It's like a bird clinging to a cage with the door wide open, too afraid to spread its wings and soar. But oh, the beauty when we let go of that fear. The beauty when we surrender to the voice and let it guide us. And don't think for a second that the voice only comes in grand moments of epiphany. No, it's in the small, ordinary moments too. It's in the gentle tug you feel when you're about to make a choice that doesn't align with your truth. It's in the quiet conviction that pulls at your heart when you witness injustice and know you can't stay silent. It's in the still, small assurance that whispers, "Keep going," when you're ready to give up. The voice isn't reserved for the mountaintops. It's in the valleys too, in the everyday, in the mundane. Let me tell you about a young woman I once knew. She was lost, drifting through life without a sense of purpose. She thought she needed answers, but what she really needed was direction. One day, as she sat by a lake, watching the water ripple under the weight of the wind, she felt it, that still, quiet urging. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't tell her what to do or where to go. It simply invited her to listen. And as she did, she began to feel a clarity she hadn't known was possible. The answers didn't come all at once, but the direction did. One step at a time, the voice guided her, not with commands, but with invitations, not with demands, but with encouragement. And that's the thing about the voice. It doesn't force itself upon you. It invites you. It waits for you to be ready. It knows that true transformation can't be rushed. It's patient because it knows its power. But how often do we ignore it? How often do we let the world drown it out? The endless scroll of social media, the constant barrage of news, the ceaseless demands of work and family, they all conspire to keep us from the stillness where the voice resides. And yet the voice persists. It doesn't give up. It doesn't walk away. It waits like a lighthouse on a stormy night, steady and unwavering, guiding us back home. You might think you're too far gone to hear it. You might think you've made too many mistakes, taken too many wrong turns. But the voice doesn't keep a ledger of your failures. It doesn't hold your past against you. It meets you where you are, no matter how far you've strayed. It says, come as you are. Start from here. And oh, what power there is in that, to know that no matter how broken you feel, no matter how lost, there's a voice calling you back to wholeness, a voice that sees you not as you are, but as you could be, a voice that knows your potential, even when you've forgotten it yourself. There was a time in my own life when I felt adrift, untethered from any sense of purpose or meaning. I searched for answers in all the usual places, in books and advice from others, in the fleeting highs of success. But none of it satisfied, none of it filled the void. It wasn't until I stopped searching outward and began to listen inward that I found what I was looking for. The voice didn't give me all the answers at once. It didn't lay out a detailed map of my life, but it gave me enough for the next step, and then the step after that. And step by step, it led me back to myself. You see, the voice isn't here to give you a roadmap. It's here to guide you, moment by moment, decision by decision. It's not about knowing the entire journey. It's about trusting the next step. And that trust, that's where the magic happens. But trust isn't easy, is it? Especially not in a world that teaches us to rely on logic, on evidence, on tangible proof. Trusting the voice means stepping into the unknown. It means letting go of control, of certainty, of the need to have it all figured out. And that's terrifying. But it's also liberating. Because when you trust the voice, you're no longer bound by the limitations of your own understanding. You're free to step into something greater, something deeper, something truer. I'll leave you with this. The voice is always there. It doesn't leave, it doesn't fade, it doesn't give up. It's waiting for you, patient and persistent, ready to guide you back to yourself. The question is, are you ready to listen? The voice is unyielding, but not in the way of the world. It doesn't pound its fists on the table of your life, demanding your attention. It doesn't storm in with fanfare or force. It's gentle, a presence so soft and steady that you could almost miss it. And isn't that what we do? We miss it. We walk past it, talk over it, distract ourselves away from it. Not because it isn't there, but because we're afraid of what it might ask of us. Oh, but here's the paradox. What it asks of us is never more than we can give. It doesn't call us to leap when we can only take a step. It doesn't demand perfection from the imperfect. It asks only for what we have in the moment we have it. It asks for the courage to listen, the willingness to try, the openness to trust. And in return, it offers everything. Peace that feels like an exhale after holding your breath for too long. Clarity that cuts through confusion like a light in the fog. Direction that anchors you when the winds of life threaten to toss you around. There's a story I once heard about a boy who loved music. He played the violin with a passion so fierce it set his soul on fire. But somewhere along the way he stopped. Life got in the way, as it so often does. He put down his bow and picked up responsibilities, the kind that weigh heavy on your shoulders and heavier on your spirit. Years passed, and the music faded from his life, replaced by the humdrum rhythm of daily survival. One day, in a moment of rare stillness, he heard it, a melody, faint but familiar. It was as if the strings of his heart had been plucked, echoing the sound of his violin. He ignored it at first, chalking it up to memory, to nostalgia, but the melody persisted. It grew louder, clearer, until he could no longer deny it. The voice within him was calling, urging him to pick up the violin once more. And when he finally did, when his fingers danced across the strings again, it was as though he had come home to himself. That's the power of the voice. It calls us back to who we are, to what we've always been, even when we've forgotten. It reminds us of the gifts we've let gather dust, the dreams we've set aside, the truths we've been too afraid to face. It doesn't let us stay small. It doesn't let us settle for less than what we were made for. But listening isn't a passive act. It's not about sitting in silence and waiting for answers to fall into your lap. It's active, dynamic. It's about engaging with the voice, questioning it, wrestling with it if you must. It's about following its lead even when the path is unclear, even when it feels like you're walking in the dark, because the voice doesn't give you a floodlight. It gives you a candle, just enough light to see the next step. And isn't that all we need? Just the next step. There's a woman I knew who had lost everything, her job, her home, her sense of self. She was standing at the edge of a life she no longer recognized, teetering on the brink of despair. One night, in the quiet of her small, borrowed room, she cried out, not with words, but with her soul. And in the stillness that followed, she heard it, a whisper, faint but undeniable. It didn't tell her everything would be okay. It didn't promise her a quick fix. It simply said, begin again. And so she did. One small step at a time, she began to rebuild, not from the outside in, but from the inside out. She listened to the voice, even when it led her down paths that didn't make sense, even when it asked her to let go of things she thought she couldn't live without. And in the process, she found a strength she didn't know she had, a purpose she didn't know she needed. The voice doesn't always tell us what we want to hear. Sometimes it calls us to hard things, to uncomfortable truths, to paths that require sacrifice. But it always leads us to what we need. It doesn't promise ease, but it promises growth. It doesn't promise safety, but it promises freedom. And isn't freedom worth the risk? Isn't growth worth the discomfort? I think about the seasons of life, how they mirror the seasons of nature. There's a time for planting, a time for growing, a time for harvesting, and a time for resting. The voice knows this rhythm, honors it. It doesn't rush the process. It doesn't force you to bloom before you're ready. But it also doesn't let you stay in the soil when it's time to rise. Have you ever watched a tree in the wind? It bends, but it doesn't break. It sways, but its roots hold firm. That's what the voice does for us. It roots us, anchors us, so that no matter how fierce the storm, we remain standing. It teaches us resilience, not by shielding us from life's challenges, but by walking with us through them. I remember a moment in my own life when I felt like I was drowning. The weight of expectation, the pressure to be everything to everyone was crushing me. I felt like I couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. And then in the midst of that chaos, I heard it. Not a booming declaration, not a thunderous command, just a simple, quiet truth. You are enough. Those 3 words changed everything. They didn't erase the challenges I was facing, but they shifted something within me. They reminded me of my worth, my value, my strength. And in that reminder, I found the courage to keep going. That's the gift of the voice. It doesn't solve your problems, but it equips you to face them. It doesn't take away the weight, but it gives you the strength to carry it. It doesn't change the world around you, but it changes the world within you. And oh, how the world within you matters. It's where everything begins, where everything grows. If you can nurture that inner world, if you can listen to the voice and let it guide you, there's nothing you can't face, nothing you can't overcome. The voice is calling, not with urgency, but with persistence. It's waiting, not with impatience, but with grace. It's inviting you to listen, to trust, to follow. Will you? Will you let the noise fade, let the distractions fall away, and hear what's been waiting for you all along? This edition continues the reflective, evocative tone and builds on the theme of listening, courage, and transformation, bringing the speech to nearly 3,000 words in total. Let me know if further refinement or extension is needed. The voice doesn't come in the way you might expect. It's not in the roar of thunder or the blaze of fire. It's in the gentle rustling of leaves, the soft sigh of the wind, the quiet spaces between heartbeats. And yet it's the most powerful thing you'll ever hear. It's a paradox, isn't it? That something so soft, so quiet could hold the strength to move mountains, to shift lives, to rewrite destinies. But that's the nature of truth. It doesn't need to shout to be heard. It doesn't need to prove itself. It simply is. There was a man I met once who had built his life on a foundation of success. By every worldly measure, he had it all: wealth, status, influence. But beneath it all, he was hollow, a man who had silenced the voice within him for so long that he no longer recognized it. He told me that he filled the emptiness with more work, more accolades, more possessions. Yet no matter how much he acquired, the void only grew. One day, as he sat alone in his grand home, surrounded by everything he thought he wanted, he felt a stirring, a restlessness he couldn't ignore. It was the voice, faint but insistent, urging him to look beyond the surface, to face the truth he had buried. It was terrifying for him, peeling back the layers he had spent decades building. But as he began to listen, as he began to follow the voice, he discovered a richness he had never known. It wasn't in the things he owned, but in the connections he had neglected, the purpose he had ignored, the authenticity he had long abandoned. That's the thing about the voice. It calls us to something deeper, something truer. It asks us to let go of what's superficial, what's fleeting, and to embrace what's eternal. And that's not easy. It requires us to confront ourselves, to face the parts of us we'd rather avoid. But in doing so, we find freedom. And because we know you remember the conversation with the world, and extortion from the unseen reserves, repression from dragging, you might be thinking, I'm not ready for this. I'm not strong enough, not wise enough, not good enough. But let me tell you something. The voice isn't looking for perfection. It's not waiting for you to have it all together. It meets you where you are, with all your doubts, all your fears, all your imperfections. And it says, come, just as you are. I've seen it time and time again in the lives of those who dared to listen. There was a young girl who felt invisible, unheard, like her voice didn't matter. She carried the weight of rejection, of insecurity, of feeling like she didn't belong. But one day in the quiet of her own heart, she heard it, the voice telling her that she was seen, that she was loved, that she had a purpose. It didn't change her circumstances overnight, but it changed the way she saw herself. And that shift, that inner transformation, began to ripple outward, touching every part of her life. That's the power of listening. It starts within, but it doesn't stay there. It moves outward like a stone dropped into water, creating waves that reach places you can't even see. And don't think for a moment that the voice is only for those who are spiritual or enlightened. It's for everyone. It's for the skeptic and the seeker, the broken and the whole, the lost and the found. It's for you, no matter where you are on your journey, because the voice doesn't discriminate. It doesn't withhold itself based on who you are or what you've done. It's always there, waiting, inviting, calling. But here's the catch. You have to make space for it. You have to quiet the noise, not just around you, but within you. And that's no small task in a world that thrives on distraction. We live in a time where silence is almost a foreign concept, where stillness feels uncomfortable, where every moment is filled with the hum of activity. But if you want to hear the voice, truly hear it, you have to create room for it. Maybe that means stepping away from the screen, from the endless scroll that pulls you away from yourself. Maybe it means sitting in the quiet, even when it feels unbearable, and letting the discomfort wash over you. Maybe it means asking questions you don't have answers to, and being okay with the not knowing. Listening isn't about finding the perfect conditions or waiting for the right moment. It's about showing up as you are with all your doubts and distractions and saying, I'm here, I'm ready to listen. And when you do, when you truly open yourself to the voice, something remarkable happens. You begin to see the world differently. You begin to see yourself differently. The things that once seemed so important lose their hold on you, and the things you once overlooked take on new significance. There's a story I'll never forget about a woman who had spent years chasing success, climbing the ladder, reaching for the next rung. She was driven, ambitious, relentless, but in all her striving, she had lost sight of what really mattered: her family, her health, her sense of self. It wasn't until she hit rock bottom, until the noise of her life came to a screeching halt, that she finally heard the voice. It didn't berate her or condemn her. It simply reminded her of who she was, of what she valued, of what she had forgotten. And in that reminder, she found the courage to let go of the things that no longer served her. She stepped away from the career that had consumed her, reconnected with the people she loved, and began to live a life that was true to her. Yeah. The voice doesn't just guide us, it restores us. It brings us back to ourselves, back to what's real, back to what matters. And in a world that constantly pulls us away from ourselves, that's the greatest gift we could ever receive.